In the swirling mists of late 19th century Chicago, a city throbbing with the pulse of industrial might and shadowed by social upheaval, the stage was set for a story that would haunt American criminal history for centuries. It was the year 1893, and the world's eyes were on the city as it hosted the monumental World's Columbian Exposition. This grand event, celebrating Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas, drew over 27 million visitors, a staggering number given the era's transportation limits and an ongoing economic depression. Chicago, rapidly emerging as a bustling global metropolis, became a magnet not only for dreamers and entrepreneurs, but also for the transient, the desperate, and the deceitful. Amid the clamor of the fair and the backdrop of a city transforming at breakneck speed, a figure emerged whose name would become synonymous with the darkest facets of American crime. Herman Webster Mudgett, better known to history as H. Holmes. Among the first to be dubbed America's serial killer, Holmes captured the public imagination through stories of a labyrinthine edifice he constructed, a murder castle, where unimaginable horrors supposedly unfolded. The narrative told of secret torture chambers, hidden gas lines, trapdoors leading to unspeakable deaths, and victims who included innocent fairgoers lured into a nightmare. Yet, as compelling as this portrait sounds, it is critical to move beyond such lurid myth-making. Rather than a straightforward retelling steeped in sensationalism, the truth demands a more discerning look, a peeling back of the layers of yellow journalism, and Holmes's own self-aggrandizing confessions that together crafted a legend far removed from reality. The murder castle, rather than being a monstrous torture palace, was instead an elaborate facade, a cunning architectural maze designed less for killing and more for deception, fraud, and financial schemes. To understand Holmes, you must first grasp the essence of late 19th century Chicago itself, a restive city grappling with rapid expansion, immigration waves, and the socioeconomic tensions of the Gilded Age. The 1893 Exposition was both a symbol of hope and opportunity, and a magnet for con artists and criminals keen to exploit the chaos. Reports from the time mention a so-called criminal army swelling within the city's teeming population, fueled by the influx of transient visitors. In this environment, Holmes found fertile ground. Born as Herman Webster Mudgett in 1861 into a well-to-do New Hampshire family, Holmes's early life was severely troubled, scarred by violence, neglect, and early signs of a twisted mind that would shape his nefarious future. But the monstrous figure history remembers is not simply the product of inherent evil, but the result of his calculated ambition, driven primarily by greed rather than a bloodlust for killing. From his beginnings, Holmes exploited his intelligence and charm, not just to evade law enforcement, but to swindle, cheat, and manipulate those around him. When Holmes arrived in Chicago's Englewood neighborhood in the mid-1880s, using the alias Dr. H. Holmes, he quickly immersed himself in a pattern of complex financial fraud. His murder castle was commissioned in 1892, a three-story building erected at breakneck speed. The construction itself was chaotic and secretive, with Holmes hiring and firing workers rapidly, arguably to prevent any one individual from fully understanding the building's layout or its true purpose. The resulting structure, often described as an architectural monstrosity, was indeed complex and labyrinthine, honeycombed with trapdoors, walled-off sections, secret passages, and oddly configured rooms. It featured soundproof chambers and hidden spaces, which fueled speculation and horror in the press. But rather than functioning as a hotel for fair attendees, the building primarily served commercial storefronts and apartments, with its upper floors never fully completed. Much of the detail that fed public nightmares, gas chambers, torture rooms, basement crematoriums, were the products of an overzealous press hungry for sensational headlines. Early newspapers were eager to depict Holmes as a devil incarnate, coining terms like multi-murderer and painting horrifying images that seized on the grotesque and macabre. Stories of body disposal pits filled with quicklime and acid, secret gas lines for executions, and hundreds of victims trapped inside vanished into myth when investigators found scant evidence supporting these claims. Indeed, the building's trapdoors and secret rooms were far more likely devised for hiding stolen goods from creditors than for trapping or torturing victims. The murder castle was not a macabre house of horrors, but a masterpiece of deception, designed deliberately to swindle suppliers and investors by ordering vast quantities of goods on credit, hiding them within the building's secret spaces, and then selling them before paying debts. Holmes's criminal mind saw the building not as an instrument of sadistic murder at scale, but as a tool for complex financial fraud. Holmes's murders, confirmed and probable, were indeed real and ruthless, but these victims were largely acquaintances or business associates, not random tourists drawn indiscriminately into his web. His methods were chillingly calculated, using chloroform, asphyxiation by gas, or confinement in airtight rooms. Yet these killings were often directly tied to his attempts to eliminate liabilities, conceal fraud, or cash in on life insurance policies. The idea that he murdered hundreds of fairgoers within the murder castle remains unsupported by credible evidence. This foundational understanding repositions Holmes not merely as a sadistic monster, but as a master fraudster whose lethal crimes served a cold calculus of financial gain and self-preservation. It was Holmes's skillful manipulation of social trust and his exploitation of the Gilded Age's rapidly shifting economic landscape that enabled his criminal enterprises to flourish amidst the frenzy of the World's Fair. As this episode unfolds, we will delve further into the nuances of Holmes's criminality, the troubled origins that shaped him, the construction and secrets underlying his infamous building, and the brutal, yet calculated murders that ultimately led to his downfall. We begin by piercing the veil of myth and legend that has long obscured the man behind the murder castle, revealing instead a story of deception, ambition, and the darker truths lurking beneath the spectacle of sensationalism. From the very beginning, the story of Herman Webster Mudgett, the man who would become known as H. Holmes, is a tale steeped not in simple monstrosity, but in complexity born from a deeply troubled past. Born on May 16, 1861, in the quiet town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire, Holmes's early life was anything but serene. Beneath his outwardly privileged upbringing lay a childhood shadowed by violence and neglect. His father, Levi Mudgett, a strict and often physically abusive Methodist farmer, was known to silence his children harshly, sometimes with cruel methods like exposure to kerosene vapors when noise disturbed him. Meanwhile, his mother, Theodate, was described as neglectful, contributing further to an emotionally barren environment for young Herman. These bitter experiences marked the soil in which Herman's dark tendencies took root. From an early age, there were alarming signs that his psyche was fractured. He is reported to have engaged in acts of animal cruelty, behaviors psychologists today recognize as precursors to more violent tendencies. There are even unsettling accounts hinting at a possible early murder disguised as an accident when Herman was just 11 years old. Whether these early acts were cries for attention, twisted experiments with power, or evidence of nascent ruthlessness, they painted a chilling picture of a boy for whom empathy and restraint were absent. Yet, despite these disturbing behaviors and social isolation, Herman Mudgett possessed an uncanny charm, a magnetic personality that allowed him to manipulate and deceive even those in positions of authority. At school, he was sometimes bullied, but also exhibited a peculiar ability to ensnare others in his web of influence. One tale recounts how classmates cruelly placed a skeleton's hands on his face in a doctor's office, perhaps awakening a morbid curiosity or fascination with death, an interest that would shadow him into adulthood. Rather than a simple narrative of a boy born evil, his early life reveals a complicated interplay of trauma, isolation, and a developing talent for manipulation. This early fascination with death and medical science propelled him toward the University of Michigan's medical school, where he pursued formal education in a field that would later serve as his grim playground. Though he was an erratic student at best, Herman managed to graduate. But it was not an honest education. His time in medical school was marked by a dark enterprise, financing his studies through morbid schemes involving insurance fraud and the illicit trade of corpses. He filed life insurance claims on fictitious persons or even fellow students, then produced mangled or unrecognizable bodies, often stolen from morgues or graves, as proof to collect fraudulent payouts. Not only was he breaking the law, but he was betraying the sanctity of human remains, treating bodies as commodities to be bartered and sold to medical schools, no doubt fueling his eerie confidence in exploiting the dark margins of legality. This grim enterprise during his formative years hints at the origins of the criminal mindset that would later define his adult life. It was not just violence or sadism that drove Herman Mudgett. It was an insatiable hunger for control, profit, and deception, wrapped in a veneer of respectability. When he moved to Englewood, Illinois in the mid-1880s, leaving behind his first wife and child, he adopted the alias Dr. H. Holmes. The choice of name itself carries weight, whether as a means to evade justice or a nod to the famed fictional detective Sherlock Holmes. It marked the start of a new, darker persona. In Chicago, Holmes reinvented himself as a charismatic, glib, and attractive figure, seamlessly conning businessmen and entrapping women with the ease of a practiced predator. His bigamous marriages, targeting wealthy women for their fortunes through life insurance policies, underscored a ruthless, calculating streak. This was no impulsive or uncontrollable murderer. Holmes was a master manipulator who understood and cruelly exploited the legal and financial systems of his time. He perfected a technique known as pyramiding fraud upon credit, borrowing money with worthless notes, rapidly building properties only to abandon workers unpaid, and ordering supplies on credit before selling them off to evade creditors. He sold surefire cures for diseases, marketed restaurants he did not own, passed worthless checks, and even invented gas machines secretly tapping city mains to appear functional. These petty frauds were pieces of a larger pattern of deceit and exploitation. Violence in this frame was not random but calculated, a cold, rational method of protecting his schemes or securing financial gain. As listeners begin to see the man behind the myth, Holmes's early life and schemes reveal a chilling evolution, from a neglected, abused child fascinated by death to an educated yet unscrupulous con artist who cloaked his greed in charm and legal exploitation. Far from the mythic sadistic fiend, he emerges as a darkly intelligent figure, one who leveraged deception, legal loopholes, and human trust as his weapons. The seeds of his later, more notorious ventures were planted here, in the cold calculation of insurance fraud during medical school, and a growing mastery of manipulation. Holmes was not simply a figure of horrific violence, but the embodiment of a new breed of criminal whose cruelty was intertwined with cunning and a profound lack of empathy. Understanding these early chapters dispels the one-dimensional monster myth and offers a more disturbing truth, that behind the legend of H. Holmes lies the story of a man born to deceive, whose psychological scar tissue was as murderous as any weapon he would later wield. This troubling genesis sets the stage for what is commonly remembered as the murder castle, illuminating how deception and financial exploitation were as central to Holmes's criminal identity as any acts of violence. As we transition into the next chapter, listeners will come to understand that the building in Englewood was not solely a house of horrors, but a cunning architectural fraud, an extension of the man's lifelong pattern of manipulation, calculated risk, and greed. Behind the facade, the real story of the murder castle. When one hears the name H. Holmes, immediate images come to mind: a shadowed fortress of terror, a labyrinthine murder castle filled with sinister trapdoors, gas chambers, and hidden torture rooms designed to prey on unsuspecting victims during the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. This Hollywood-style horror story has become so deeply ingrained in popular culture that it seems nearly unassailable. But as we peel back the layers of myth and sensationalism, the true story of Holmes's infamous building emerges, not as a chamber of horrors, but as a masterclass in deception and financial fraud. The three-story structure Holmes had built in Englewood, Chicago, was far from a Gothic palace of evil. Constructed feverishly and under a veil of secrecy, the building appeared outwardly unremarkable. Yet its architectural oddities did exist. Trapdoors, walled-up rooms, concealed spaces, winding hallways, even secret closets and soundproof rooms. But these features were not instruments of mutilation or mass murder as the legends suggest. Instead, they served practical, if unusual, purposes aligned with Holmes's true expertise. Con artistry. Holmes orchestrated the building's construction with deliberate chaos. Workmen were frequently hired and fired, changes were continually made, and much of the craftsmanship was of poor quality. This frenetic turnover mangled any one person's full understanding of the layout, creating confusion and a lack of accountability. But the goal was not terror. It was to maintain secrecy over the building's true functions and to protect Holmes's schemes. The trapdoors and secret compartments were cleverly engineered to function as stashes for stolen goods, furniture and merchandise purchased on credit that Holmes promptly hid away. By bricking up rooms and maneuvering goods into concealed areas, Holmes could confuse creditors and delay the repossession of expensive items. The building itself became a maze of financial obfuscation rather than a site of physical entrapment for victims. Stories about dozens or even hundreds of rooms leading to brick walls or dead-end stairwells collapse under scrutiny. The third-floor hotel was a nascent and modest operation, never fully completed, and never opened for business. In fact, the so-called hotel never functioned as such, not for a single day. Rather, the entire premise of a lavish hotel with guests disappearing into torture chambers was the product of rumor, sensationalist journalism, and Holmes's own fabrications. One of the most enduring myths is the existence of subterranean crematoriums and gas chambers, an image so chilling it fueled decades of macabre fascination. Yet investigative findings reveal no such thing. The basement did contain an unused quicklime pit and a large gas tank, elements that investigators and reporters of the time wildly extrapolated into evidence of mass body disposal operations. The large furnace found on the property was misrepresented by the press, inflating it into a crematorium designed to erase countless victims. But Holmes's murdering on such a massive scale, let alone the disposal of bodies in these supposed facilities, lacks factual support. The overwhelming consensus is that Holmes found such elaborate death machinery to be impractical and unnecessary. Holmes's confirmed victims were not anonymous tourists funneled into the building's labyrinth. They were people he knew, business partners, romantic interests, and accomplices in fraud. There is no substantial evidence Holmes lured fairgoers into his building to kill them. The notorious murder castle was largely a house of lies, constructed to enable Holmes's sprawling fraud ventures rather than serve as a den of torture. The complex design helped him perpetrate financial trickery, hiding stolen goods and evading creditors. Holmes took out life insurance policies on various acquaintances, and his violence was tightly wound up in eliminating liabilities and maintaining his fraudulent empire. What this reveals is a paradox. A castle, famed for murder and horror, that was, in reality, a cunning architectural ruse. Holmes was not an architect of physical entrapment, but of deception. The real purpose behind his building's peculiarities was to sow confusion and conceal stolen assets, ensuring his fraudulent schemes could continue unimpeded. Far from being a grim torture den, the building itself was a testament to Holmes's manipulative genius and greed. The public appetite for sensational stories combined with the era's press eager to sell shock and horror, transformed the property's purpose into legend. Exaggerated tales of rooms filled with traps, secret torture chambers, and gory devices far outstripped facts. These lurid fictions overshadowed the building's true function and Holmes's core criminal identity as a conman. The myth of the murder castle allowed the public to frame Holmes exclusively as a monster of unparalleled cruelty, obscuring his equally dangerous role as a calculated fraudster who wielded deception with surgical precision. In unmasking the murder castle, we not only dismantle the Hollywood-style horror surrounding H. Holmes, but also gain a clearer window into the mind behind the myths, a man whose cruelty was deeply entwined with his boundless greed and cunning. The building stands less as a monument to sadism and more as a monument to lies, revealing Holmes's true legacy as a master manipulator whose greatest weapon was fiction itself. This understanding challenges us to reconsider other crime legends and the powerful forces, media sensationalism, public fascination, and self-serving confessions that shape them. It primes us for the next phase of this story, where we will explore Holmes's confirmed crimes, his motives, and how his carefully constructed web of deception ultimately unraveled, revealing the chilling human cost behind the facade. In the annals of American crime, few names evoke as much chilling fascination as H. Holmes. Yet, beyond the lurid headlines and grotesque legends, lies a story both calculated and devastating, one defined not by senseless violence, but by cold ambition and ruthless deception. This is the true account of Holmes's confirmed crimes, with the notorious Pitezel family case at its grim heart, a tale where lives were pawns in a merciless game of insurance fraud and betrayal. Holmes was no random predator stalking the shadows. He was a man who preyed upon those closest to him, acquaintances, business partners, and even his own mistresses. His murders were a methodical means to an end, driven by financial gain rather than mere bloodlust. Money was the poison whispered in every act of death he orchestrated, and the victims were expendable obstacles to be eliminated with frightening efficiency. Central to unmasking the true extent of Holmes's danger is the tragic saga of Benjamin Pitezel, a skilled carpenter with a shady past, who became entangled in Holmes's elaborate schemes. Together, they concocted a counterfeit demise, faking Pitezel's death to claim a staggering $10,000 life insurance payout. Holmes's duplicity, however, knew no bounds. In a ruthless twist, he rendered Pitezel unconscious with chloroform, ignited his body in a staged accident, and assumed complete control over the insurance proceeds. But Holmes's treachery did not stop there. Fearing discovery, Holmes turned his sinister calculus toward Pitezel's children, Howard, Nellie, and Alice, murdering these innocent youths to suppress any threats to his carefully constructed lies. His deceit extended to their mother, whom he manipulated into believing her husband lived and the family was together, relocating her and the remaining children across cities to maintain the illusion. Each step was cloaked in cold pretense, revealing a perpetrator who wielded charm as deftly as a weapon, ensnaring victims not from the darkness, but directly from his circle. This spiraling web of lies came undone through diligent detective work, spearheaded by Philadelphia's Frank Gaia. Gaia's painstaking multi-state and international investigation uncovered the bodies of the Pitezel children, some buried in Toronto, others discovered cremated in Indiana. These grisly discoveries shattered Holmes's deception, laying bare the depth of his calculated crimes and cementing his link to the murders. The investigation into the Pitezel case was a watershed moment, illustrating how methodical detective work could unravel even the most complex and far-flung criminal enterprises. Holmes's subsequent trial in Philadelphia began on October 28, 1895, marking a dramatic chapter in criminal history. Opting to defend himself, Holmes employed theatrics and manipulation in the courtroom, oscillating between false confessions that boasted of dozens, even over 100 murders, and denials that sought to recast him as a misunderstood figure. These proclamations were not sincere admissions of guilt, but strategic acts to control the narrative, to mythologize himself amid the frenzy of public and press fascination. The trial, far from a straightforward legal proceeding, was also a stage for his final performance, a desperate gambit to assert some semblance of power until his conviction on November 2nd was sealed. His confessions woven throughout the trial were filled with contradictions and invented tales, often amplified by a sensationalist press eager to feed public appetite for horror. Claims of murder numbers ballooned far beyond verifiable victims, with some sources inflating counts to as many as 200, yet only 8 victims are confirmed, with the Pitezel family case the most tangible and thoroughly investigated. This discrepancy between truth and exaggeration underscores the extraordinary influence of media in shaping Holmes's enduring legacy, and the considerable challenge in disentangling fact from fiction. Holmes's execution on May 7, 1896, did not bring the final word. His death closed the legal chapter, but the story of H. Holmes continued to evolve, amplified and distorted through the swirling narratives of journalists, authors, and pop culture. Dubbed with menacing epithets, arch-fiend, the devil incarnate, monster of 63rd Street, Holmes's persona morphed into a monstrous myth, embodying primal fears and captivating imaginations far beyond his actual deeds. Works like Erik Larson's The Devil in the White City have further enshrined Holmes in cultural memory, blending history with storytelling that enchants and horrifies, though sometimes at the expense of nuanced truth. Yet beneath the monstrous veneer lies a more chilling reality. Holmes was not merely a madman killing for pleasure, but a calculating fraudster who used murder as a tool within a larger scheme of deceit and greed. His murder castle, so often described as a torture palace, was primarily a labyrinth of financial deception, not mass homicide. His victims were not random tourists, but people he knew, partners, acquaintances, and intimate relations whose demise served his insatiable desire for wealth and control. As the dust settles on the legend, we are left to grapple with the complex interplay between myth and history, the way media sensationalism, personal self-mythologizing, and public fascination collide to fashion a character larger than life. Holmes invites us to question how history paints its darkest figures and challenges us to seek the truths hidden beneath layers of exaggeration and spectacle. In understanding Holmes's story, the motives, the murders, and the unraveling of the Pitezel case, we glimpse not just the anatomy of a killer, but the darker currents of ambition and deception that defined an era. It is a story that continues to haunt the collective consciousness, blurring the lines between fact and fiction, and reminding us that sometimes the greatest horror lies not in the imagined monster, but in the calculating mind behind the myth.